Okay, welcome to the program. This is The Otherppl Show, a weekly podcast featuring in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. I'm Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. It is good to be with you. Don't forget to subscribe to this show wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and you can follow me on social media. I'm on Bluesky and Instagram. So my guest today is Ocean Vuong. He has a new novel out called The Emperor of Gladness. It is available from Penguin Press. The Emperor of Gladness tells the story of Hai, a young man from the town of East Gladness, Connecticut. He is 19. He is struggling with addiction and suicidality, and he ends up in an unlikely friendship with an elderly widow who is slowly succumbing to dementia. Hai becomes her roommate and caregiver while he also is working at a local restaurant. The Emperor of Gladness is a novel with a lot to say about life on the margins in contemporary America. It is a story about labor and loneliness and chosen families and small moments of grace. I had a wonderful conversation with Ocean Vuong, and that is coming up in just a moment. Today's episode is brought to you by Mulholland Books, publisher of the novel Buzzkill by J. Robert Lennon. Buzzkill is the official May pick of the Otherppl book club. That is my book club. And if you would like to join the book club, you can do that at otherppl.com. I will be in conversation with J. Robert Lennon, talking with him about Buzzkill later this month, so stay tuned for that. One more time, the novel is called Buzzkill, the official May pick of the Otherppl book club by J. Robert Lennon, available from Mulholland Books. A quick reminder before we get going that I have a newsletter. It is over at Substack. You can subscribe at bradlisti.substack.com. It's a great way to keep up with this podcast. I will let you know on a weekly basis about the latest episodes. I also share a list of links to things that I've been reading and finding interesting. I also want to quickly plug my new company, which is in the works and will be launching later this year. It is called Deep Dive, and it specializes in the creation of long-form educational audio. The debut course from Deep Dive is called How to Write a Novel, and it will feature more than 50 hours of never-before-heard dialogues with dozens of today's leading writers, including Melissa Broder, Emily St. John Mandel, Steve Almond, Vivi Ganeshananthan, Matthew Salasis, Matt Bell, Madeline Lucas, Tiffany Clark Harrison, Purchista Hakpur. The list goes on. So I'm very excited about it. You can sign up for the Deep Dive newsletter over at www.deepdive.audio, and you can follow Deep Dive on Bluesky and Instagram. Once again, my guest is Ocean Vuong. His new novel is called The Emperor of Gladness, and it is available from Penguin Press. Ocean's other books include the acclaimed poetry collections Night Sky with Exit Wounds and Time as a Mother, as well as the New York Times bestselling novel On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous. It was great to meet Ocean and to talk with him, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. This is Ocean Vuong.
I started on January 18th, 2020, only because that's what I wrote on the notebook. I write by hand, so that was the first notebook for this project, and it was 7 weeks after my mom died, and it was right before we didn't know COVID was going to happen. And I think it was the first book that I ever wrote in its entirety without her in my life. And so I've been very ambivalent about that. I'm trying not to think too much about it, but it feels very different. It feels very funereal. Not the book itself, but the release of it for some reason. And maybe also because my uncle's suicide haunts the book. He died in 2012. He was 28. I was 24. So we grew up we came to this country together in 1990 after a stint in the refugee camp, and we were like brothers. And I always I started the book with an attempt at suicide because I always wanted to know what, in society, when we talk someone off the ledge, whether it's a news segment or a film or a story, everyone kind of claps and then everyone goes home. And I wonder often if we're clapping truly for that person, or we're clapping because there's a kind of relief that society has been restored to its norm, that someone standing on the edge of a bridge is a kind of rupture to normative social progress. And I always wondered what would day 2 look like for someone who decides to step away from the ledge after contemplating taking their own life. What does day 3 look like, day 20? And I never got to ask that of my uncle. So I wanted to start a book in the aftermath of that decision, because one of my favorite theorists is a contemporary British theorist named Terry Eagleton. And he, in his book on hope, he says suicide is actually a hopeful act. One does it in hopes of ending immense suffering. And so to then step away from that and choose to live doesn't necessarily mean you have any hope. Doesn't mean your life is in any more order than it was yesterday. And yet you still have to continue. So that was kind of the big, I guess it was bracketed by my uncle's death and my mother's death. And then I thought, it was an exciting and difficult place to write through a story. This is not so much life, the decision to live at the end, but the decision to live without hope at the beginning.
Yeah, I lost a good friend to suicide when I was in college. And it's a really tough way to lose. I mean, it's tough to lose anyone you care about, but when you lose them to suicide, I feel like there is so much mystery.
Yeah.
That's how it seemed to me anyway. It was just like, well, you'll never know what happened. There's this psychological space that they were occupying at the end of their life that is entirely private, and it's all just kind of foreclosed by their death. And I can imagine why creatively you would choose to open your novel as you did, because it allowed you, I guess, maybe some entree to that moment.
Yeah. And I guess as a poet, I'm always trying to slip away from, I don't know, like things that are expected of what the genre should do. And I thought there's so much, we always are told in workshops and manuals on writing that there should be some kind of change, some kind of transformation. This goes back to Aristotle, right? There should be catharsis. And it's interesting because Aristotle implemented that idea as a response to his teacher Plato, who felt that the poets or the storytellers were too dangerous for the Republic, right? Because they would quote unquote corrupt the soldiers, the warriors, with emotion. Right? So God forbid your warriors are too emotional; they won't be able to uphold the Republic. And Plato thought they should be banished. And Aristotle tried to find a middle ground, and he said, well, maybe we can, instead of banishing the poets, get them to write stories that will ameliorate the revolutionary vexations within the populace. So then the Romans took that and created the Colosseum, right? If all the energies to overthrow the world or having the violence in us is kind of ameliorated in spectacle, then the populace won't overthrow the Republic. And that aligns quite neatly with commercial aspects of storytelling, right? We expect our novels to deliver a good, the same way we expect our washing machines to deliver some promise, our cars, right? You will find the body at the end. You will find the killer. A girl gets the guy gets the girl, rags to riches. And I just wanted to write a novel where nothing changed. Transformation happens without change. I think that's a Wong Kar-wai quote. I could have sworn he said that, and then I couldn't find it anywhere. He's probably in an interview. But he said that when making In the Mood for Love, and it just blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, of course, that's exactly what that film is about. It's total internal transformation, but no material logistical change in the characters. And it was, in a sense, very anti-Western in that sense. So I was inspired by that. And I wanted to kind of just try my hand at that, stay in one place, these people don't even care about places like New York or San Francisco or Paris. Like, they know they exist, but these characters, they're ambivalent to that. And I felt that was a powerful place to be.
So your novel opens with this suicide contemplation. It happens on a bridge, and your protagonist is a young man named Hai, who is, I believe, 19 years old.
Yeah.
And he is an opioid addict, and he is really just he's on the cusp. He's still a boy. He's not a man quite yet, and he's uncertain about his prospects in life, to say the least. And he winds up being talked down off the ledge, as it were, by a woman named Grisina, who is an 82-year-old Lithuanian woman who lives alone and is in some stage of dementia. And they end up an unlikely pair. So not only is this a novel that begins sort of on the precipice for Hai in terms of his decision to live or not, but it's also a novel about unlikely bonds, unlikely friendships, and unlikely community. And I'm wondering at what point that particular theme became apparent to you. Was it always your desire to write about like loneliness and chosen family and just the unlikely friendships that sometimes flower in life kind of beautifully? There's something very beautiful about the relationship between Hai and Grisina. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think so much of American life, maybe this is coming from my position as an immigrant, where I've been told, everything is about the nuclear family, from which I never had one. My family is very strange in that it was 4 women who gave birth to all boys. 4 women who kicked their husbands out of their lives because they were behaving poorly and they were abusive. So that was kind of like the first American act in my consciousness, was like all the women divorcing or leaving their husbands, taking their sons and then raising them in America. And so the nuclear family was kind of unfeasible, or it just wasn't there for me. But that, however, is like the central tenet of what consists of a good American life, quote unquote. And after that, if you're antithetical to that, you can say there is a kind of found chosen family. But for me, I think a major part of American life that's underdeveloped or underexplored is the circumstantial family that comes from labor, people cobbled together on a shift, people who stumble upon each other. There's something actually really robust about that we rarely talk about. And yet that is kind of the central tenet to a fiction work in American tradition, Moby Dick, that is completely foundational. I mean, you go to the Strand, the fiction aisle has a whale, right? It's now like a symbol. It's so pervasive, and yet we kind of forgotten that part of American life is labor and the family and the kinship in labor. And when I worked in various jobs, I worked on farms and fast food. After a while, who is behind you by their cough, by their gait, by their breath. You can tell by the 3rd hour what their BO smells like when the drugstore perfume and deodorant wears off, and then you start to hear things that I'm particularly interested in, how like human speech acts subvert the sort of construction or the conditions that they are in, right? So there's like entire buildings where we can say certain phrases, do you solemnly swear? Do you promise to tell the truth, nothing but the truth? Or congratulations, class of 2025. And then there are buildings where you're supposed to say, hello, how can I help you? I'm sorry. And then in those spaces, like things are breached, confessions, secrets that I think you don't even tell your family or your priest. You would tell your coworker, because you know your coworker is going to leave at 5 p.m. and you're never going to see them again until the next shift. And so there's a liminal space. And you know, the show, what do you call it? Severance is now tapping into that in a really interesting way. But that has always kind of occurred in American life, and it's relatively underexplored, I felt. So it was a right place to kind of tap into.
Yeah, I was thrilled. I mean, the job that Hai works is at what is it called? Fast casual? I don't know how to characterize this. But
yeah,
it's like
I mean, yeah. They would call it fast casual, but it's just a fast food joint, you know.
It's a fast food joint, but they have a little bit of pride in the fact that it's a bit more upscale.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, there's some humor in this book. I think this is a funny book in a very sly way, which I want to make sure to emphasize. Like, I found myself laughing as I was reading on multiple occasions. And I was also thrilled to see, for personal reasons, the fact that this restaurant setting was a big part of the novel, and that this work life in a restaurant was a big part of the novel, because I have been mulling over a novel in my head. I haven't written a word of it yet, but I've just been thinking. I'm in that mode where I'm just kind of ruminating. And one of my best friends, I've known him since we were kids, has basically worked in restaurants since he was a teenager. And we talk on the phone a lot. So I have been hearing restaurant stories my entire life.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating. And there is this kind of forced intimacy and this kind of pressure cooker environment that people who work in restaurants live within. You know, especially him. He's working at like a high-end steakhouse where there are like really demanding customers, and there's a performance aspect to it. But I just find it really, really fascinating. And I can relate on some level. I think anybody who's ever worked a job can relate to the ways in which you find yourself in league with your coworkers day after day. And the more time you spend, the more intimate it gets. And it's this forced family.
Oh my God. It's so emotional. I mean, it's, and also, like, regardless of whatever ideologies you hold, how disparate they are, kinetic kinship degrades and corrodes the validity of those ideologies, right? So, like, one anecdote I didn't put into the book. You know, I swear, as I'm getting older, I'm just realizing, like, life is so much more corny and dramatic than fiction allows. Like, sometimes it's like I can't put it in because it's too like, you know, serendipitously contrived things in my life, and also speech acts. Like, people talk mostly in cliches, and I find cliches and corniness actually very endearing, because it just feels like it's the moment where, like, human interaction fail to create novelty. You know, like I had a friend who just had a really rough loss a few months ago, and I was so frustrated. I was like a poet. I'm standing before her, and I'm just like, I'm so sorry. I'm just trying to say, like, time will make it better. But as soon as I said it, I hated it, and I'm having this like I'm like melting down in front of her, and I'm just like, let's just sit and read a book and just not talk. I can't do this. And I just felt like, here I am, the poet, and there's nothing I can say, there's nothing I can grab except what's already available. And I just feel like that failure to invent in times of need is actually really endearing, because we're pushed up against the capacity of what we have. But yeah, the restaurant is just, you know, I had a boss, a very mean boss. And I kid you not, you know, James Wood would probably say this is hysterical realism, but he was a Pakistani refugee. He's a religious refugee from Pakistan who was an evangelical Christian, and that's why he had to flee. He became the manager at this Boston market I was working in, and he had these huge nose pores. I mean, they looked like pencil points, right? And he would eat cornbread during break, and then the crumbs would get lodged into the pores, and he wouldn't know, and he would start, you know, running the shift and yelling at us while there's a tape playing televangelist speeches on his hip. And it was just like the most chaotic, but yet, like, at the worst moments of the shift, like, we needed him, he needed us, and there was a kind of tenderness, right? He started calling, I think because there was like, he was listening to these like Texan Southern televangelists, so he adopted their speech, And so he would like use son in like a weird way. He's like, come on, son, you can do. I'm like, I'm losing my mind. I feel like I'm in like an acid trip, right? Go get it, son. You got it, son. And I was just like, wow, how is this possible? But I was like, 17. I didn't think anything. You just kind of go through it. But in retrospect, I was like, gosh, I can't put this in a novel. It's too much.
I was going to say, yeah, it would. No one would believe you.
Yeah. You got to pull back. Yeah.
So I want to talk a bit more about Grisina, the 82-year-old Lithuanian woman with whom Hai finds himself roommates, and he finds himself her caregiver. Curious where that character originated.
Yeah, I knew her. I knew a woman named Grisina. I lived with her. That's how I got through to college. I lost my housing when I was here in New York after I dropped out of Pace University. And long story short, I was couch surfing. I wrote an essay about this years ago in this little anthology called Love Christopher Street. And I think it's only in print, but you can probably find it online. And I wrote about just this moment in my life. And I ended up long story short, I ended up in Penn Station, sleeping there for about 2.5 weeks, February 2009. And, but I wasn't like chronic. I mean, by then I was a matriculated student at Brooklyn College. I could shower on campus. I could stay in the library till like 9:30. So I only used Penn Station just as like a 5-hour, 6-hour window to sleep, charge my stuff in the Starbucks. But it was it was what it was. And I was talking to a friend of mine and said, hey, I can't believe you're living like this. I have a grandmother who's alone in Richmond Hill. It's where Jack Kerouac, like 5 blocks from where Kerouac used to live. And if I asked my mom, maybe you can just stay there and take care of her. And I didn't think much of it. But then a few days later, he was like, my mom said yes. He was just 22 in law school. We were like kind of dating, but I realized I can't date. My life is in shambles. Like I'm trying to get sober. It was just a mess. But I landed there and it was his grandmother. And so after a few weeks, he would start visiting to see her and then me. And so now we're just like this weird family. And like a few months in, I'm like, should we just date? Should we just do this? And then he said, yes. And 18 years later, that's Peter, who you just talked to.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's his grandmother. And so what I learned was that, we had a lot in common. She's a refugee. And her traumas were just like my grandmother's trauma. She fled Stalin, was in a camp in Germany right after the war. And, he's the second generation from that. The house that she lived in was the first and only house she bought after coming to America in the 50s. And, both our families didn't have any generational wealth. We were kind of the first. He's going to law school. I'm trying to be a business person / poet. And it just really, really worked in ways I didn't understand until now in retrospect, but at that time I was like, wow, why do we just really get each other? And it was because of geopolitical rupture.
Well, that's another way that I've seen your novel be characterized, is that it is a novel about the consequences of violence, the long consequences. And I thought that was a pretty astute take. I hadn't thought of it, in those terms. But Hai and Grisina are both dealing on some level with those long consequences. Their fates have been in some ways determined by like acts of violence.
Yeah. And war is such a central part of American life. I mean, it's interesting, right? You think of how politicians use the Revolutionary War as a kind of traction, but also, try to buy an apartment or rent an apartment or try to talk to a real estate agent, and you realize, oh, this is a pre-war home. This is a post-war home. This is an antebellum Greek revival. I was like, it's the casualness of which we mark time and construction and livelihoods with war in this country is kind of baffling. And that's kind of the undercurrent of this novel. There's actually 4 wars in this novel: World War II, Vietnam War, the Civil War, and the Iraq War. That's the contemporaneous war of 2009. And all of it all these characters are asked to make a life in the aftermath, the long shadow of American war. And that seemed to be kind of what I was really interested in, was that how no one could escape the shadow of war, for better or for worse, in this country. And they kind of compound against each other in all these myths that these characters make of each other.
Well, there is another character that I want to talk about, and that is Sony, who is Hai's cousin. And Sony is dealing with some disabilities. And I am always moved, because I rarely see it, but I'm the father of a disabled child. So whenever I see disability rendered on the page in a really human way, I appreciate it. And I'm curious to know about the origins of Sony and the decision to include him in the novel.
Yeah, I have a cousin who is autistic. It took a long time. Like he was only diagnosed like 2 years ago. We all knew, but then again, like we didn't know, because there were so many other frameworks for it that was available culturally or not available culturally. Right. So for a lot, my grandmother thought he was had like a third eye, right? She's just like, he's just tapped it. She saw it as a positive, like a powerful thing, which is really actually really helpful for us. But growing up with him, it was also very normal, because that's just who he was, you know. And I think that's what one of my hopes for these characters is that, you know, the omniscient third, which is what I use, or the close third, whatever, regardless of that position of omniscience, you don't know anything about a character until they until they discover it. That's one of the craft points that was important to me. You don't know Sony's artistic until one of the characters find out. The narrator never knows that or tells you that. Same with racial positions. No one's introduced directly by their race. You just find out the way everyone else finds out, by living and kinetic. And sometimes these things are not revealed until halfway or towards the end of the book. And I felt that was important for me to kind of, it's not their personality. Queerness also, you know, for Hai is not his personality. It's just part of the detritus of his life and Sony's position as well. And I wanted them to just, you know, to not have the disability function as a plot. That was always very important to me. That it's just there. It's a weather system rather than this technology in the plot that serves something larger. It just is amongst itself. A lot of the stuff I got from Eastern narratology, particularly Miyazaki, and Eastern autofiction, right? So autofiction is really important to me, but I'm always kind of like bristling and trying to crawl away from the sort of shadow of American understanding of it, which is like an early aughts, mostly around like white suburban ennui or vexation. And of course, you know, the criticism is that it's navel gazing or self-involved. Some of that is very valid. But I'm trying to push towards a more global reading of autofiction. Like, for example, the Japanese at the turn of the 20th century, at the late 19th century, coined the term shishoshetsu, which is the eye novel. And Natsume Soseki was the one that pioneered it. And from there you have Mishima, Tanizaki, Murata more recently. But my interest in autofiction aligns more closely with those writers in Japan, because they saw during the Meiji Restoration, when Japan was kind of forsaking its cultural roots in order to turn towards modernity. It was denying its, you know, like this whole Mishima's whole like revolution, you know, he killed himself. He tried to create a revolution, was trying to restore Japanese culture, the samurai code, all that stuff. He saw it was being washed away. And so my interest in autofiction is that there's no cop-out from history. You're always embedded. You as a writer are always embedded in the web of history. And the Shishoshetsu novelists were asking something really important, like, what is the self? What is the value of interiority when major cultural shifts are occurring that erase the past? And that was a really exciting position for me as an American, or as an American who came out of war. Like everything we write about, if the I is close to the I in time, then you always have to consider yourself in relation to the historic aftermaths.
Well, it just sounds like autofiction with much larger concerns or deeper concerns.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, that was true with Melville, J.D. Salinger, the Bell Jar, right? All those writers, D.H. Lawrence, right? I think you're absolutely right. I think maybe American autofiction kind of actually came from a larger web of autofiction, but then narrowed it to a kind of more localized, domestic concerns. I'm not sure, but I think that's right. It was always kind of quite large. I think all novels come from a larger web. If we go back to Gilgamesh and the Odyssey, those major epics started with war. It was always about displacement, and it's interesting in like literary culture, like, because the literary culture is so often niche in a way relative to the rest of the world, rest of society, and it's often very upper middle class. There's often stories that I write are seen as like exotic, but I always have to push back and say, no, like relative to our history, living in the suburbs and watching Netflix, that is exotic. That is still very new. It's lovely. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in relative peace? But it's still like incredibly a new idea for the majority of our species. Stories come out of major geopolitical upheavals.
Well, I want to ask another question about Sony. It has to do with his name. He's named after the electronics company.
Yeah.
And I want to say when that name is discussed early on, like at the introduction of Sony, it is revealed that this was not entirely uncommon.
Yeah, it's a very common thing, especially for Vietnamese refugees of the time. The mode of aspirational naming is already embedded in Vietnamese culture. So our framework is nature, right? So Hai means the sea. Rose, my mother's name is Rose. My aunt's name is Sen, which is lotus. So sunset, wind, mountain, spring, summer, these are all names. There's an beautiful androgynous name named Ngọc, which is pearl, right? So men and boys and girls both named Pearl, which is like an aspirational. And then also like ideas, like you'd be called purity, calm, peace. So many people named Bun, peace after the war, like a whole generation of children. It's beautiful. It's a kind of incredibly, the aspirations of the family coming out of incredible trauma is to name their children peace, right? And from that, once the diaspora entered America, I had friends named Simba because the Lion King was so edifying to their family. Mercedes, BMW. I wrote in the book, there's a friend named MJ Karl Malone, right? Which is like, all of that, the 90s basketball glory into one asthmatic child. And I love that. I just love that about Vietnamese culture, where it's like there's a kind of reverence and auspiciousness to words and naming. And I wanted to bring that in. And then of course it gets warped with commercial Americanized vexation and Sony, right? It's easier to make your own Sony than to go buy one. If you couldn't afford it, you could just make one.
Well, Sony is obsessed with American history, like Civil War history. It's kind of an expert on all of this stuff. And this is a kind of recurring motif throughout the novel. It's like a lens through which to kind of see the events that are unfolding in real time. And I found it to be a really interesting choice that this would be his obsession. I would also say, just as a parent of a disabled boy who has his own obsessions, I could totally relate. Like my son is obsessed with going to IKEA. I've been to IKEA like 11 times in the last, like 3 months. They're like, you again? They know us, we walk through. But I totally got that. And I'm just curious to know about that choice.
It was part of our childhood, My cousin has his own obsessions. The Civil War is actually my obsession. One thing we talk about autofiction, but one thing that is important to me is that I make sure to never tell anyone's story. Even in the first book, people think that's like straight up memoir. It's not. It's like the context of it is my life, but the people, how they're animated, who they are, completely fictional. Same with
Can I just interrupt? That's On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous.
Yeah. The first novel, and Grisina too. As a person, her story is not told. It's just the context. There are things that she told me that she has taken to the grave, and I will take to my grave. And I think that's just an ethical thing for me as a novelist, that I never interviewed my family for material. I just wasn't brave enough, but I also couldn't do it. It just felt so vampiric. And I thought, well, I'm a novelist. I gotta just make it up. And that actually made it more interesting, because then because a novel is just a list of contrived drama, right? And life is actually much more boring than that. Life is actually, like, as James Salter said, life is weather, life is meals, right? And a novel is a lot more drama. And so Sony has, as my the inspiration for my cousin, is the obsession is there, but the Civil War obsession is actually my obsession. And it was just growing up with 3 channels in Hartford with and if you get the tinfoil positioned a certain way, you might get 6 or 7. But the perennial channel was TNT, Turner, and Turner himself, as some might know, is a huge patriot, right? He actually funds a lot of Civil War movies. And during almost every national holiday, Veterans Day, July 4th, Memorial Day, they would have marathons of war movies. So I encountered the film Gettysburg, starring Jeff Daniels and Martin Sheen, again and again. Like 3 times a year I would see this movie, and with commercial breaks it would last maybe like 5 hours. And so throughout my childhood I was able to watch it maybe in its entirety, maybe 3 times through multiple chunks of the years. And I learned early on, like, gosh, there's just like an incredible propaganda to film. You watch that movie and you would never know they were fighting over slavery. And I found myself kind of seduced by the visual grammar of it, the close-ups, the pathos. And I didn't know what they were fighting. I'm like a 7-8-year-old kid, but I'm looking at these like grandpas. They look like Santa Clauses, they're deeply worried. They're in their rocking chairs with blankets over them and the fireplace, and they're just like, tomorrow we will find if God has given us the hand. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is crazy. This is incredible. Like, what are they fighting for? And I felt myself rooting for the South, because they were always losing. They were outnumbered. They were in rags, right? And I really related to them as a refugee. I was like, oh, they're from the South. I think we're also from the South. We're from South Vietnam. We also wear rags. There's photos of my family in rags. There's also a civil war, I think, where I come from, And so it's the power of pathos and the close-up. Meanwhile, another film that's showed is The Green Berets, or Apocalypse Now, on the same channel. And the Vietnamese bodies are usually shot from a distance, dying in droves, right? To the point where their particularness, their livelihood, their personhood is completely erased as only corporeal, moving towards a corpse. Literally piles of people. Whereas, a traitor like Robert E. Lee gets an immense monologue, right? Full of emotion and beauty and teary-eyed, wistfulness. And it was like the greatest education of fictive possibility I had, even though I didn't know it at the time.
That's interesting that it was speaking to you in some profound way. Like, even as like a 7 or 8-year-old boy, you could recognize it.
Yeah. My grandmother was the same age as these generals, and she was the matriarch. So we all looked to her when she spoke, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of grandparents or grandfathers, in on horseback being really worried about who knows what, right? And I was just like, gosh, when did this happen? Like, when did grandparents? I mean, that war is wild, because you would enlist with your neighborhood, and like a 65-year-old baker would be right alongside like a 21-year-old carpenter. And in 1 week you're, buying bread from each other. Next week you have a musket and you're just marching into, another group of intergenerational fighters. And it was so, nothing like that ever existed again in the American military.
Did you ever see the Big Vuong documentary? Who's the Ken Burns? The
Ken
Civil
Burns,
War.
yeah. It's unfortunately a really bad as far as facts. It's really he's a filmmaker, so he picked the most dramatic quote unquote scholars. One of whom is not a scholar at all. Was actually kind of like an apologist, a Southern apologist named Shelby Foote, because he had an incredible accent.
He's like the star of the movie. I remember just watching. He was a riveting speaker, but
yeah, and he was just like, we almost had him. He just like I'm like, what are we? But he spoke as if they were all his relatives, and it did what it had to do. But I think it's, Civil War scholarship has done, actually, I'll say it's severe damage to Civil War scholarship that Civil War scholars are still trying to recuperate from, because as soon as you talk about it, someone says, well, have you seen that? And it neutralizes the moral, realities of the war. It presented at kind of like these two equal sides fighting for whatever, and it has this kind of deeply emotional charge of kind of benevolence, right? Paternal benevolence of people like Lee and Stonewall Jackson, which is, unimaginable to think of, and which is what the film did too, right? That was exactly what it was. It created, as if they were just kind of, you can just pick and choose. I mean, I went to Stonewall Jackson's house in Lexington, Virginia, and you go to the museum and then you look at the gift shop, and they literally have like coloring books, of Confederate generals, as if it's just like a team that you can pick, right? It's as if they weren't like, trying to overthrow our country. It's really bizarre. You would never have that of any other enemy of America.
Yeah, there's something in the American character, maybe it's in the human character, that just resists like taking an honest, hard look at our past and at our behaviors. People just don't want to do that. They people gravitate to these kind of sanitized versions, and versions that maybe issue like complexity. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, who wants to sit there and grapple with the hard morality of it? I guess some people do. I mean, you do, other people do, but generally speaking, people want the coloring books and the stirring music and these portrayals that they're just more comfortable to deal with.
Yeah, and especially in America, because our founding is already ripe with moral aporia. Like there's no way to go about it, right? Our founders enslaved people. We stole bodies from another continent to produce free labor. I mean, it's rough. There's no way to massage that. And I think, that's why terms like "Make America Great Again" is so intoxicating, because it performs memory, but it's actually amnesia. Because if you ask, I live in rural Massachusetts, and you drive 20 minutes and you'll see a Trump supporter. And so you have to just you have to be with people. Like, it's interesting, in New York, people are very averse to other opposite opinions, but I have to, if you have a leak, your plumber might be a Trump supporter. And you have to just talk to him for, it'll just go off, and you're standing there, talking about faucets, but meanwhile he's going off about the deep state and Hillary Clinton eats babies, and you just have to listen. So I'm kind of like involuntarily enmeshed, but I'm not, I think that's the world. I have to tend to it. I have to, be into it. I can't just shut it away. But it's interesting when I asked I've asked Trump supporters, like, where is the great again? It's very fascinating kind of anthropological response, because almost all of them, from various ages, people in their 20s, their 60s, 70s, 40s, they almost always say it was the area of their childhood, right? They always they describe things around age 8, 9, 10, 11. So I think there's kind of nostalgia. There's like nostalgia is kind of being weaponized into a political power. It always was in a sense, but it's interesting that they might, even those who believe that phrase don't have a consensus of when exactly that was.
Yeah, I'd always understood like the general like right-wing consensus, if there were one, on when like the halcyon days of America were. It was like the 1950s, right?
Yeah,
like that's like the white picket fences and like the post-war boom and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, some people, it's like, the early 90s.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah. Like it goes on. I mean, for some kids, they're like, 2004, it was amazing. It was a perfect time. I was like, so it's interesting that when you test them on it, there's a kind of, that distance creates a very subjective coloring. But even the 50s, it's like, well, that's the introduction of like some of the highest uses of, SSRIs and antidepressants. And so like clearly we were also very sad. But for some reason that has kind of been branded as like the city on the hill, but as Sylvia Plath was kind of like the testament of that in the bell jars, told us it was kind of like a horrifying place to be, depending on who you are, especially as a woman.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend who wrote a novel. It took place in Poland, and it was about the Warsaw Ghetto and the aftermath of the war. And she had been over there and had gone through some kind of World War II museum in Poland, which is a very dark, kind of depressing place. And like, I think the last room in the museum, she was describing it, where there's this quote from FDR where he's like, "We can trust Stalin. He's not going to take over Eastern Europe." But basically completely wrong in his assessment. And then she was describing being at the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And like the last room is like the post-war boom, and there's like a big Buick, and there's like soldiers kissing nurses, and the American mythology around the end of that war. And it's like, oh wow, I think the bill of goods that we have been sold is not the truth.
Well, you're spot on right there. Mythology is the word. And my personal feeling for myself around fiction is that there is no neutral ground. There is no like even though there's like a work that's evacuated of overt politics, it's still political, and a political aspect of a work is often up to the reader, not always up to the writer. Like there's a lot of indigenous criticism really valid of like reading Robert Frost, for example. They say, oh, Robert Frost is quintessential apolitical poet, and many people might agree. But then if you read it from an indigenous lens, you realize there's this dude having like romantic epiphanies on an indigenous graveyard of New England, like all that. It's a ghostly, if you read it from that angle, you realize it's incredibly political and elegiac. But I think, that's that deep vexation is just so embedded into so much of how we think and feel as Americans.
Do you have any idea of what it would take for us to properly reckon with the darker parts of our history? I think about this. It's like, because like, how far back do we go, and like, what would we have to do to heal?
I'm not sure. I mean, that's the perennial question. I don't know if. Here's where maybe what do the kids call it? Black pilling. I don't know if healing is even the destination. I worry about the framework around that as someone who writes a lot about intergenerational trauma, because healing in our hyper-commercial, hyper-capitalistic language and grammar is like a site of amnesia, right? If I'm healed, and then I'm done. If I'll get that pill, if I'll buy that thing, it will solve my issue and the wound will close, and then I can live and start anew. And then I guess like the problem for me is that maybe to me the healing should be more about allowing the scar to rise, right? Like allowing a way to move forward without erasing the scar, right? Because we have to remember. Like when I was in Italy, I was invited to read in Milan at the Palazzo Reale. And this was early on before I wrote the first novel. I was invited by my poetry publisher. And I gave a reading there. And then afterwards, they said, we want to show you a different wing of this palace. It's a royal palace of Milan, right in the square. And I said, oh my God, I'm so honored, please. And they brought me to this, it looks like a huge ballroom, like just right out of Versailles, right? This sort of like quintessential Renaissance architecture. And they said, turn on the lights. They turned on the lights. And I looked on this wall, and it was probably like 20 feet high. And you saw giant cracks in it, as thick as my arm, like running down. And they said, when the Americans bombed us during World War II, we started to raise money to fix this. And when we raised enough money, all of a sudden, all of us decided in the town, in the city, to not fix it. Because if we restore it, we will erase the memory of what was done to us. So these scars must stay. And these are coming from the people who build airports around Roman ruins, right? So to them, like, memory is the destruction of a thing is part of its life. And often when we think about like museum restoration, we say, oh, let's get this vase and restore it. Like that we fetishize originality and original concepts. And this is like, I think a Christian kind of obsession, right? Original sin, Genesis, that we always favor. And there's like a kind of an arbitrary knee-jerk desire to restore something to the original, but you're also choosing to erase the violence that happened to it. So by restoring the original, you're forgetting the violence. And so there's actually a politics to what part of the thing that you choose to preserve or recreate. And the Italians then really taught, and that's how I saw the solution to write the first novel. I said, I want to write a novel where all the cracks are seen. And again, like in workshop, in fiction, I'm really lucky. I've never taken a fiction workshop, so I shouldn't disparage it too much because I don't know what goes on in there. But I imagine that there's a lot of conversation about cohesion, evenness. Like if you open like the New York Times or the Guardian or something, there will be a review wherein a critical term would be it's uneven. And I guess for me as a poet, I'm like, well, why is that necessarily bad? Why should we always aspire to cohesion, smooth surfaces, consistency? Like why can't we have things that it was I was in tears in this palace because I just, as an American, where everything is smoothed over right away, right? Oh, 9/11, Freedom Tower, bigger than ever, it's just like, and I'm just like, wow, they just left it as it is. Like you can like run your hand down and the plaster will start crumbling. I was so moved by that. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm sort of like laughing to myself. Just the other day, I was sitting in front of the television, and if you do that for any amount of time, you will be barraged by a pharmaceutical commercial almost inevitably.
Yeah.
And there's this drug called Skyrizzy. I don't know if you've heard of it. I mean, these names are also just like laughable, but it's called Skyrizzy, and
sounds like a rapper.
Yeah, exactly. And there's another one called Jardiance, which has these commercials which are like manically happy, and it's like musical theater, and they're singing and dancing and the whole thing. And then Skyrizzy, which is used to treat like psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis, they're singing, and the refrain of the song, which I have heard many times, I've seen this commercial many times, but it just kind of washes over me because you get numb to this stuff.
Yeah.
But the refrain of the song in this psoriatic arthritis medication commercial is nothing is everything. And I was just, all of a sudden I heard it. Like I actually heard it. And I was like, what the fuck are they singing? Nothing. I mean, God. There's something kind of instructive in it. And it speaks to this like desire to like, just, what is it? Paper over everything. And this like, the whole purpose really is just to sort of enter into some sort of blank state of, I don't know what you would call it, like neutrality or perfect detachment or something.
Yeah, like medically induced comas, except you can still walk around. I mean, that's kind of what so much of the antidepressants do. And I've never been on them, but I have friends who are, and it's interesting that we call it. I think it's really true. It's also edifying that we call it studying medicine and not studying health. Right? It's like that's really what happened. Everyone studies the medicine and then they learn how to prescribe it. But health is often not part of the prospect. The prospect might very well be nothing.
Yeah, I have so many bones to pick with our healthcare system, but like the fact that I go to a doctor and like no doctor has ever talked to me about like what I'm eating, like ever. Yeah. They don't even ask. They don't care,
And try to get it's also like interesting because there's a lot of politics to that too, like with being Asian, right? Because like people would just say, "Oh, you're so young." It's like they said it to my mother, and then she had terminal breast cancer. And I was like, "No, she looks young to you, but she has these symptoms. Oh no, she'll be fine. She looks young, right?" So there's always like this idea of like infantilization and then on the other end, like for many Black Americans, their pain is not believed, right? And so you have to always fight to be heard, and even then, even if you don't have those obstacles, your body is no longer a network; it's just symptoms that are addressed. I mean, I had a friend who she was in the medical field, and she was so specialized at the point where her entire medical practice was just a square inch on the neck. And she just did thyroid surgeries. And she had this occurrence where this woman kept coming back with thyroid issues, and she kept performing the same surgery like 4 times. And she's just like, how come the immunology never talked to me? Oncology, virology, because these are metabolic potential problems, but no one talks to each other. We fetishize the specialists, and this is true of academia too. Like I've been in public and private schools, and you in English departments, and you can sit next to somebody in a meeting, and they would only have read Chaucer for 35 years, and it's kind of like surreal. It's like they can't talk about anything other than the wife of Bath's tale or something. And I'm like, what happened? Like, how do we get so siloed? But I know why it happens, because we fetishize the expert. Like we want to, as a culture, go to a reading and prescribe expertise to somebody. So then we feel like we get a major payoff, right? And like I had a friend who wrote poems about mental illness, and then people in her readings like, well, how much dosage should I get for lithium? And she's like, I don't know. Like, but that's what we want someone to be, like the final site of all knowledge, just because we talk about it. And it's horrifying. And I'm sorry you're experiencing it, especially with a child with special needs. And I'm navigating it now with multiple family members, and it's just.
I was going to say, like you don't realize until you're dealing with a health issue yourself, or you're a caregiver for someone who is, how on your own.
Oh my God.
You can feel. You're like, oh wow. Like so much of this is a mystery, first of all. And there's a lot of things that doctors just don't know, which never really occurred to me until I was in the situation where the doctor's like, yeah, we'll just have to sort of, it's going to be trial and error, and we'll see how this goes. And it's like, wait a minute, you don't have an answer. And then on top of that, then it's access to care, and it's will insurance cover it, and all that stuff, I
mean, I was told, I have friends who are physicians, they work in hospitals, and, but they're kind of like very skeptical of everything. They're really great. And they told me that as soon as, I don't know how true this is, but they said, as soon as a doctor graduates from medical school, within 2 years, everything that they've learned in those 6 to 8 years is now too old. Like you learn it all, and it immediately expires because the medicine happens so fast, and yet they're kind of like trapped in time capsules. So that set of knowledge just stays with them because they don't have to really renew anything. They just keep going. And so you have a bunch of doctors who are just kind of in their own separate sort of era of knowledge. And it's kind of like a crapshoot who you get. And whoever you get, they probably will not be on top of the research coming out. But then I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot. That's how it feels. That sure is how it feels like as a patient.
Well, I was just gonna say, it feels like that time frame might even shrink with like the advent of AI and the integration of AI in medicine.
Yeah.
Who knows what it's going to feel like to go to the doctor 10 years from now. But I want to shift gears, and I want to talk about Buddhism and Buddhist psychology and like a Buddhist worldview and how it relates to the work that you do as a writer. I think one of the first things I ever read from you was an essay or an elegy that you wrote for Thich Nhat Hanh,
right?
Who is a huge figure in my life. And I think I was prepping for this conversation and read that your mother used to listen to Thich Nhat Hanh Dharma talks on her phone. Mm-hmm. And I smiled because I was like, I spent a solid decade, if not longer, listening to a Thich Nhat Hanh Dharma talk every single morning while walking my dog. I felt a little strange about it. I was like so obsessed, but I found such wisdom in him, such like authentic wisdom in him.
Yeah.
And became I guess a Buddhist practitioner. Like it's not formalized, but really had a big impact on me. And I know that his life and work had a big impact on you too. And I'm just interested to hear you talk about it. I mean, you come to this, Vietnamese Zen Buddhism more naturally than I, since you're of Vietnamese descent, but just interested to hear how it's impacted your life and, when it took hold for you or made an impact on you, like at what stage of life?
Thank you. Well, I'm so pleased to hear that. And thank you for that question. Not a lot of people ask about that angle. And it's bigger to me than literature because it came before literature. And I'm going to be very frank about it. I never had the dream of being an author just because that's never available to me. When I was growing up, being an author was as real as being a poet. So I really stumbled into this. As I said, I dropped out of business school and I was at open mics and then, in New York, and someone said you could be a poet and what have you. So for me, the precursor to the impulse to write was this grand, to me, as a 15-year-old, aporia of why do we suffer so much here? And yet, why do we have such an immense capacity to recognize beauty and wonder? I was growing up in an opioid epidemic before it was like a term politicians use. Like the same thing a contemporaneous thing that happened in 2008 was a friend of mine overdosed, and he was. I was not with him that night. He was one of my best friends, and he was with friends who were also using, and they freaked out. This is before Narcan. This is before you had any sense of what it is. This is before it was like destigmatized. And so they freaked out and they just dropped him in the back of his house. And his mother opened the door the next morning, like getting her paper, and then saw his body. Ugh. And it's, and it's strange because I grew up in a time where it's similar to like the generation that got the T model Ford for the first time, where it's like a week before you're riding a horse, and then 2 weeks later you're in a vehicle. And that's what the iPhone was to me. That's what social media was to me. I didn't have an iPhone until I was like 24. And so like I have these group of friends, this cluster of friends who died, and I don't have any photographs of them. Like they're not even. I do this weird thing where like in the middle of the night I would search their names and I only get the obituaries or the news reports of their deaths, and I have no idea if they were even ever real. And it's just so surreal to think that way. So I guess like I was just like, what is this? I can't go on like this. I was like, there's gotta be something. And then my family, Vietnamese Buddhism is so ritualized that it's similar to what I understand of Catholicism, where it's just like so much ritual, smoke, incense, that sometimes you don't know what it is. And my family, quite frankly, didn't know. I was like, Mom, why do we put bananas on this table in front of the statue? She's like, just do it.
Don't ask questions.
Like, just do it or I'm going to lose my job. I was like, what? You know? And so I realized that they didn't know either. But it was just kind of this ritual that it was somewhat like a somatic exercise that like rooted themselves in reverence. And that was enough of a bonus of a productive place in their life where there's like, you know, don't walk too fast in front of the altar. That's the Buddha. You have to respect it, right? So it was on the other hand of that, the negative side was almost like a panopticon, right? When I'm like alone, I'm like, all right, is he just watching me like eat soup, or like, you know, like should I jerk off in front of him, or is that going to be, you know? So, but when I was 15 and 16, I was like, I need to get out of here, metaphorically and physically, because I'm going to end up like these friends who are just vanishing. And I went to the library, the public library. I went to the Buddhist section, and I just started reading. And the stunning thing that I came upon was at the same time Zen Buddhism via the Japanese, and then Thich Nhat Hanh, and then the Tibetan tradition. But all those traditions, immediately what was powerful was that they said, you are not your past. You can change right now if you decide to. It's a mathematical, kinetic reality that if you want to change who you are, you can do it right now. Change your actions. Your mind will follow, and there will be confluence. And then you want a decent life, have a decent day, and it will accumulate to a decent life. And all of a sudden, because before that, I felt like, gosh, I'm in the quote unquote ghetto, which is what we called it. We called our neighborhood the ghetto. It was Section 8 HUD housing. And, you know, I couldn't even get like an aspirational job. Like when I was 17, my mother sat me down and said, okay, son, you have to work, try to get a job at McDonald's. I said, wait a minute, what? What about like American upward mobility? What about chasing your dreams? Like most parents tell them their kids to be a lawyer or businessman or something. I said, no. You need to get a job at McDonald's, because if you make any more than minimum wage, our rent, our income will go beyond the Section 8 threshold and we will be kicked out. So our rent would go from $400 a month to $2,500, and we would literally be houseless. So imagine being 17 and just confronting like the death of your friends, and also like the reality that you're trapped in this glass ceiling. And I realized I just gotta find, I would if I could change my life, it would have to be immediately. I couldn't wait for anybody. I don't want to pray for someone to come save me. I want to make it happen. And that to me felt really powerful. I would say that was the first artistic impulse, you know, like to take up the pen of my own life and say, I'm going to move my body and I'm going to find a way out of this. And I started meditating an hour a day. I started chanting. I started really doing transcendental Zen meditation. And it was, you can feel it happen on your nervous system. And the same things that worried me or caused me great strife, I started to deal with a lot better. I can consider things better. And then when I became a writer, I realized that no writer can exhaust the subject. So the more time I spent looking at something, the more it would give me. And I think that's why I write very slow. You know, why 2009 for this novel, 15 years later, because I just think very slowly. But the Buddha says something really, really important. And if I were to boil down my practice to one sentence, it would be his final deathbed speech to his disciples. And he says something really interesting. He says, because all forms must decay, you must carry on with earnestness. Because all forms must decay, you must carry on your life with earnestness. And I've always thought that was so strange, because he could have said anything else other than earnestness, and it would still be viable as a religious, you know, advice. He could have said ferocity, diligence, care. He could have said passion. zealotry, but earnestness, and I think I realized how incongruent earnestness is in American society, because I think in a culture that worships seduction, co-opting, and coercion, like all of our win the vote. He's going to win your vote. We're going to win the customer base, right? It's all about capturing people for gain. I think in this culture, in that sense, being unmoved, being cynical is associated with intelligence, right? It means that you have not been seduced. You've not been duped. But to our great detriment, because in fact it's empty. It's just a position of safety. It's a kind of cowardice to just assume that to be cynical, to judge, to be the contrarian is associated with intelligence, because there's no risk to it. You haven't stepped forward. But earnesty requires you to go all in. And I found that really incongruent with American society, but absolutely congruent with the work of the artist, because you have to believe in something to try it to the end. I tell my students this. The workshop is really interesting because it's a place of like nebulous process, and they're very scared to go all the way because they don't know, and they have a very often low tolerance of failure. It's like, gosh, I tried this thing, it didn't work. I said, you didn't try to the end of it. Go to the end of that thought, to the outskirts of that thought with all your heart, all your earnestness. It sounds so corny, even to me when I say it, because I'm so conditioned as an American. But if I say, but I believe in that. And that's what I try to get them to do. It's like, just go to, because no one else is going to go to the end. Everyone else is going to stand on the line and judge because they're afraid, because this culture punishes you if you believe in something too much, right? And it makes sense, because people who believe are fooled. They've been captured. Oh, you fell for the commercial, because we're inundated by coercion. So the most safe place to be is to be unmoved. And John Berger talked about this really brilliantly in Ways of Seeing. He says there's a very common and perennial gaze of the model, the fashion model, which is to look unmovingly beyond you, right? The stare of the model is to just look way like they're already bored, right? And you want to buy the product to achieve that level of immobility, because it means that you're no longer seduced by the forces around you. There's an elevation to that power. So going back to earnestness, it's like, when you like walking your dog, listening to Thich Nhat Hanh you're trying to figure a major aporia in your life. And again, but if you say that in a workshop, people would kind of giggle, right? Which is why I bring up the brothers Karamazov, because I think Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were some of the writers that were just completely earnest. They asked the questions that I think most American writers in the contemporary space would be embarrassed to ask, which is, what is the Russian soul in the face of corruption? What is goodness in the face of the fallibility of human nature? Right? And if you say that on like a panel, people would like go, gosh, get over yourself, right? Meanwhile, as Americans, we actually appreciate that. I do think that we want those conversations, but we're embarrassed to have them in the contemporary space. But look at the work that we admire, Catcher in the Rye. Incredibly earnest work. It's like a young man trying to who's sick of it, who's trying to find something else, right? Moby Dick, similarly, Whitman, Dickinson, like these are all deeply sincere writers. So we do appreciate that. We do read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, Woolf, for example. But yet, amongst the living, when we say that, it's like, oh gosh, you can't be serious. That can't truly be what you want to do with what you're doing.
Well, this has been an outstanding conversation, and I am enormously grateful for the time. Congratulations on your new novel. And I always close by asking if there's anything else in the works. Like, do you have plans for the next book, or are you just celebrating the publication of this one?
I only work on one book at a time. Much to my family's disappointment, I only have one book contracts. I could never. You get a little more money with multiple book contracts, and I just can never do that. So because I can't like work on a ghost. I was trained as a poet, so it's just one book, one poem. Can you imagine? I'm like, hey, Brad, I got a sonnet, but I only got 7 lines. But trust me, bro. 2 months later, 7 more lines gonna be amazing. You give me half the money now, and I could do that, right? So it's like, so I work on I put everything in one thing. I think I have this kind of Noah's Ark syndrome where I just everything good, both the bad and the ugly and the beautiful goes in one vessel, and then I'm empty. And then if that's it, that's a pretty decent run. But hopefully, eventually, something fills up, and then I'll try to build towards the next book. But right now, there's just nothing.
Well, Ocean, thank you so much for your time. I wish you well.
Thank you. Nothing is everything.
All right, there we go. That was my conversation with Ocean Vuong about his new novel, The Emperor of Gladness, available now from Penguin Press. You can find Ocean on the internet at oceanvuong.com. He is also on Instagram. And once again, the new novel is called The Emperor of Gladness. It is available wherever books are sold. Go get your copy. Don't forget to subscribe to The Otherppl Show wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on social media. I'm on Bluesky and Instagram. And you can sign up for my weekly email newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. And if you enjoy this show, if you listen regularly, I hope you will join the Otherppl Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. To join the Otherppl Book Club or to get an Otherppl t-shirt, just visit the show's official website at otherppl.com. And to sign up for the Deep Dive newsletter and to learn more about my new company, visit www.deepdive.audio. Remember that you can follow Deep Dive on Bluesky and Instagram. Finally, if you have a couple of minutes and you want to help me out a little bit, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and so on. Rate the show. If it's possible to write a little review, write a little review. It helps the show find new listeners. Okay, that does it for this episode. My thanks to you for being here, and my thanks again to Ocean Vuong. I'll be back on Thursday with my friend and co-host Mira Gonzalez for a new episode of Brad and Mira for the Culture, our weekly pop culture analysis. There's a lot to go over. Mira has been out the past couple of weeks, so we have to catch up. And you will hear that on Thursday. Stay tuned.